Hello everyone and welcome to a super thrilling game from the FIDE Grand Swiss. It's round 8 and it's the leader ever since the tournament started, Alireza Firouzja versus Evgeniy, Najer, Russian Grandmaster, and it's a game that really shows you how you have to play every game up until the very end and good things might happen. So let's check it out. There's quite a lot to cover. Alireza with the white pieces opens with e4. We have e5, knight to f3 and now knight to f6. Najer goes for the Petrov defense, attacking that e4 pawn, and usually white will just capture on e5. This is the most standard plan, but here we have d4. This is the Steinitz attack against the Petrov defense, where black has two very good options. You could capture on d4 or you could capture on e4. Now captures on d4 is played on some occasions, but knight captures on e4 is considered the main move. So this is what Najer plays, and now you could continue attacking with bishop to d3, just challenging this knight, but here just d captures on e5, and now d5. Now the knight is nicely defended, and here we play knight b to d2. Now challenge this knight, saying that okay, we might capture this knight, and if captures we might capture here and then ruin your castling privileges, but it's very unlikely that white would do this, just trading queens like that very early on. Black goes knight captures on d2. This is again very standard move. Bishop captures and now bishop to e7. And now usually you'll just continue with some like bishop to d3 and then for example c5 and then c3, so you make some room for your light square bishop if black decides to attack it. But here Alireza goes c3 right away, and it is already as of move 7 that we have a completely new game, but not really, as we're going to transpose into some very popular games. So this is not actually a new move. So here we have c5 and now bishop to d3, so just a different move order. Knight to c6 and now we have castles. We have bishop to g4, now pinning the knight, preparing knight captures on e5, so of course rook to e1. We have to guard our pawn here. Queen to d7, Najer develops the queen, connects, almost connects the rooks, so you have to castle first, and here you'll be able to castle kingside or queenside, depending on what kind of a game you're interested in playing. So here h3, asking do you want to capture, do you want to move back, what do you want to do? So bishop to h5 and now bishop to f4, improving the activity of the bishop, and also now our pawn is also protected many times. So queen to e6 and now comes bishop to e2. Now the knight is no longer pinned and we can freely move the queen around. So Najer castles here and queen to d2. So what can black play here? Well, the bishop no longer serves any purpose here, so he moves it to g6, now controls this long diagonal, and now rook a to d1. And it seems white has finished development, black has yet to develop both of the rooks. So bishop to e4 now, defending this pawn. After rook to d1, the pawn was hanging, so bishop here defends the pawn, and now knight to g5. Here Alireza says, all right, I'm now winning your bishop pair, either I'm gonna capture the light square bishop or you can capture with the dark square bishop. So black captures on g5, we have bishop captures on g5, and the position has been reached before. Last time it was reached, it was in the 2019 FIDE Grand Prix between Wesley So and Yu Yangyi. Wesley won that game. Yu Yangyi played h6 here, but here we have d4 by Najer, and it is now as of move 17 that we really have a completely new game, and it's completely new unexplored territory. So here, what do you play? Well, it's very unlikely that you want to capture here. If you capture here, black just puts a knight on d4, and how are you getting rid of this knight? It's a very annoying piece, so of course we're not going to do that. Here, Alireza just brings the bishop back all the way to f1 and now asks, all right, what do you play here? Well, here we have queen to g6, putting pressure on the bishop. For the moment, the queen defends the bishop, but white has to be very careful. So queen to f4, now attacking the bishop on e4 twice, and what do you do with this bishop? Well, you could move it to d5, for example, but if you play bishop to d5, it's maybe not doing all that great. It's undefended there, you're very restricted in what you can do. This bishop might be hanging at some point, and white will get some free moves in, like for example bishop to d3. Now the bishop, rook to d3, now rook can come to g3, and it could be very annoying. So instead bishop to c2 is played, now attacking the rook, still preventing any rook lifts here, and now rook to d2, attacking the bishop, and now rook 8 to e8, asking what do you do now. So here we have bishop to h4. Now the queen can move. Also, the bishop will not be on g5 if the white queen ever moves, and you can shift the bishop to g3 at any moment to add more defense to your e5 pawn. So here we have king to h8, and now we have f3. This was a very interesting position for Alireza, as there was this very interesting bishop to b5 move. Now saying, okay, you can't move the knight because your rook hangs, and well, now if c captures on d4, you're not going to be able to capture with the knight. You're going to have to capture with this pawn, and it's going to be very weak. So how are you really defending this pawn? So here we would probably see something like d captures on c3, and after b captures, it's still a very, very difficult position to play, because once the bishop captures, the queen will have to capture, or rather the queen will not be able to capture. The queen has to keep an eye on the bishop. On c2, you're going to have to capture with the pawn. So let's something like a6 captures, you're going to have to capture with the b pawn, and then even rook d6 is a possibility. And if rook to e6, for example, now bishop to g3, and it's a very, very nice position for white, with black's structure here on the queen side somewhat dubious. But okay, after king h8, Firouzja decided to go for f3, and now we have a6, and this is this gives white some chances of improving the position. d3 was very interesting here, as now this pawn cannot really be captured. It's defended many times. You can also add more support to the pawn. Not for the moment, the bishop is covering d8, but you could, if it was really needed. For example, even f6 might be an idea at some point, but it would just be a very, very strong move, and it would really restrict the movement of white's pieces. But instead, we have a6 by black, and now, of course, preventing this bishop to b5 idea that we were discussing, and now bishop to f2. Now saying, okay, now you're not playing pawn to d3, I'm just going to capture your pawn on c5. And the situation on the clock here is 20 minutes for Alireza and 25 minutes for Evgeniy, and it's only move 23, so 17 more moves need to be played in order to reach time control. So here we have rook to d8, and now rook to c1, further harassing this bishop here. So bishop to b1, attacking the a2 pawn, but now just c captures on d4. And here Alireza went really, really low on the clock. He's already 3 minutes on the clock, and he still has to play 15 more moves in order to reach time control. So what do you play? Instead of c captures on d4, you could play something like a3, and okay, your pawn will not be attacked, but then you play knight a5, and you've allowed this knight to get to this b3 square. You really don't want to allow this. Another thing, you could have played this b3, and the rook will be nicely defending the pawn, but then you simply allow black to trade down, and that's really what black wants to do. Rook captures on c3, we can capture on d2, queen captures on d2, and now, for example, rook to d8, and black is very, very happy here. So Alireza's idea seems to be the most promising. C captures on d4, and now if you go c captures on d4, then we're just going to play a4, get rid of our target on a2, and then we're going to capture this pawn. It's attacked many times. Black will not be able to defend it. So black instead decided to capture with the knight, not with the pawn after c captures. So knight captures on d4, bishop captures on d4, c captures, and now a3. So the pawn is still a target, and you can't really defend it. If you play something like queen to b6, you no longer guard the bishop on b1, so that's not possible. So here we have bishop to a2, and now Alireza just grabs the pawn with rook captures on d4. Maybe a slight improvement could also be something like b4, as you know, why not? Maybe it serves some purpose, because you know, why waste the opportunity of playing b4 with tempo? Now the bishop is attacked, and once the bishop moves, then we collect the pawn. So maybe just throwing in that b4. But okay, Alireza plays rook captures on d4 right away, and now queen to b6. Now pinning this rook. So how do you defend here? Rook to d1, and now rook f to e8. And now we absolutely have to unpin here. So king to h2, and now we have rook captures on d4, getting rid of one of the rooks. Queen captures on d4, queen captures on d4, and the rook captures on d4. And unfortunately for black, he can't reclaim the pawn, because if rook captures, then you just get checkmated. Rook to d8, check, rook e8, rook captures on e8, checkmate. So we have to do something about this. Here black plays g5, creates some breathing room for the king, and also prevents white's a very important f4 move to really cement that pawn on e5. So here we have rook to d7. Alireza says, okay, you capture on e5. I'm going to start capturing along the 7th rank. Okay, not this one, obviously, but b7 is hanging. So black first plays b5, and now rook to d6, going after the a6 pawn, and now you can't push those pawns because then the b5 pawn falls. So here we have a trade. Rook captures on e5, rook captures on a6, and now bishop to c4. Now defending the b5 pawn, but you also have to trade down your bishop. So bishop captures on c4, b captures on c4, and now a4. So this is the position, a rook endgame where white is up a pawn and white has a passed a pawn. So can white make something of this? He's only up one pawn, and as you guys know, in rook endgames, that's not a lot. So let's see how the game continues. Rook to c5. Black wants to eliminate this pawn and then fight against the passed a4 pawn. So rook to b6, and now c3. We have b captures on c3, rook captures, and now a5. So Alireza wants to push this pawn to victory, but of course this rook can always get behind the passed pawn. So when you're pushing to victory, you want your own rook behind your passed pawn, and of course black wants his own rook behind the passed pawn. So king g7, we have to activate our kings. We have a6 now, and rook to a3. Of course, we're not going to allow white to put the rook behind the passed pawn. King to g3, and now rook to a2. We have f4, trading off this pawn for this, sort of a weak pawn. And now g captures on f4. This also means that Alireza has to give up one pawn in order to make some progress here. King captures on f4, and now rook captures on g2. And now the material is equal, so black won back his pawn, but Alireza has a bit of a more active king. So here we have king to e5, and now what do you do with the rook? Do you go after this pawn, or do you put your rook behind the passed pawn? What do you think is best here? Well, of course, it's best to go behind the passed pawn. Going after the h3 pawn would actually loses the game. Just to give you a quick demonstration, king d6, rook captures on h3, king c6, and now we're not in time. Rook to a3, we're gonna play king to b7, and once black starts pushing, we don't care, just a7, we're gonna promote to a queen, and after, let's say we trade here, we have all the time in the world to prevent this. You can't over push this pawn because we can simply attack it, and the king will not be able to capture it. To catch up to the pawn, we can easily, just grab it. So you're gonna have to play something like f6, king b7, king to g6, king to c6, and now after some like h4, you start pushing king d5. You're gonna play king g5, king to e4, f4 check, king f3, and you can see that white is very, very much in time. So after king e5, rook to a2 was played. This is best, and now king to d6. We have f5. Black's absolute best move. You have to start pushing that passed pawn. King to c7, we have f4, king to b8, and now we have f3. So a7 by Alireza, and now f2. Black also ready to promote this pawn to a queen, and here Alireza plays rook to b1. And now is this beautiful moment in the game where black can either continue playing best moves, or black can blunder the game. So feel free to pause the video and try to find the best way for black not to lose this game while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on realizing that you have to start marching with the king. So the king going down the board is the only way to save this game, and I will demonstrate why. In the game, actually, this move was played. Pawn to f1, queen to start the race, but it doesn't work. Just to show you why, you have to start going down with your king. It doesn't really matter which square you use. And now after a8 queen, and the rooks get traded off, or rather the queen is captured, king captures on a8, now king g5. And now the existence of the pawn on f2 will force this rook to remain on the first rank in order to capture it. For example, rook to f1, king h4, we're now going to capture on f2, and now king captures on h3, and now this is a draw. The rook alone cannot stop this pawn, because if you attack it, we're just going to push it, and once it gets to the king, it's a draw. And if you try something like rook to f5 to prevent it from reaching h5, we're first gonna kick it away with king g4 and only then push at h5. So that's not gonna work, and it's very easy. King b7, just h5. We're gonna play king to c6, h4, king d5, and now king to g3. It's very simple. Rook f7, h3. After king e4, we're gonna play h2, and that's it. After one check, we're gonna play king f2, and now after rook h7, king to g1, and now we either get a queen into the game or white has to just continue checking us. If king f3, of course, this is just an instant draw. This is promoted with check now, captures, and well, we would have a draw by insufficient material. But after rook to b1, Najer played f1 queen, and it seems like the race is identical, but it's not, because now after Alireza captures the queen, you don't really have rook captures on a7, because now after king captures on a7, the white rook doesn't have to, you know, play rook to f1, then rook captures on f2, and the black king is behind too many tempi. King h6, we're gonna play h4 even, and after king h5, just rook f4, and you're never getting that pawn off the board. We can just move our rook. The pawn will never be able to be pushed, and we can just, you know, use all the time in the world to bring our king into the game. So instead, after rook captures on f1, rook to b2 check was played, but now king to a8, rook to b3 going after the pawn, but now rook to c1. You no longer have to take care of the pawn. So here we have king to g6. Black has to, you know, starts doing something, and now rook to c7. So we're gonna block the b file with our rook, get a king away from the a file, and then promote our pawn to a queen. And now again, if you capture the pawn now, it doesn't really matter. We're just gonna play rook c6 check, king to g5, and after king to b7, that's it. Rook to b3 check. We're gonna play rook to b6, and after rook a3, just rook to a6. And after rook to b3 check, we're just gonna move our king. King to c7, king to c6, doesn't really matter. After the king is checked, we're gonna go back. It's important that we do not allow the black rook to give itself up for the pawn. So here, rook to d3, we're gonna move here. Rook here, we're gonna move here, and after rook here, we're gonna move here. There are no more checks. On the next move, we bring a queen into the game and win this very hard fought game. So after rook to c7, we have h5, but now rook to b7. And again, now if rook to a3, just king to b8, and after king to g5, we can simply play rook to b4, and you can never cross this. Next move, we just bring a queen into the game. Black has to give up the rook, and that's it. So after rook to b7, rook captures on h3 was played, but it is much too late for such things. So rook b6 check, king g5, now king to b7, and it's pretty much the same idea. The white king will be able to hide behind the black king in order to avoid all the checks. So rook a3, rook to a6, we have rook to b3 check, and now king to c7. And it was in this position on move 59 that Evgeniy Najer resigned the game, as there is nothing more to be done here. So it's the exact same thing. Now, if we continue checking the king, we're just going to run away and hide behind the black king, and that's it. Rook f3 check, king g6, king g7, and that's it. Next move, we bring a queen into the game, and of course, you have no way of playing this anymore with black. So really incredible game, and it really shows you how you have to play every game up until the very end in order to win games like these, because Evgeniy Najer is a very strong grandmaster, and of course many other players would just agree. Yeah, of course, we have 3 pawns each, that's a draw, let's call it a day, and we play another game tomorrow. But as Magnus would grind, as Bobby Fischer would grind, it seems Alireza also enjoys grinding, and he grinds down a very strong Russian grandmaster here, which also means that he is now the sole leader after 8 rounds. We're also gonna discuss the standings a little bit. Here they are. So the top of the standings, Firouzja in first place with 5.5 out of 7, followed by 3 people with 5, Maxim, Vashyl Agrav, Krishnan Sasikran, and Alexei Shirov, and then a lot of people with 4.5 and 4 points. So he's doing great so far. 4 more rounds to go. He's the sole leader of the Grand Swiss, and if he plays those 4 rounds well, he gets into the next cycle of the FIDE Candidates Tournament, which means that if he wins it and he goes up to challenge the world champion, Magnus or Nepo in this case, for the title, we could be looking at our youngest world chess champion ever, I believe, as he's currently 18, and I don't think or rather, I don't know when the next cycle will be. Like some people are saying that the next candidates, okay, maybe will be in 2022, and then maybe even the World Championship will be in 2022. Some are saying that it will be shifted to 2023. So who knows with everything what's happening in the world? But he is definitely on a nice path. We'll see what happens. So yeah, that's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. A bit of a longer one, but end games are like that. I would like to thank Lucas Theokaris, James Maybury, Abdul El Traore, Frank Combs, and David Leal for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of this spectacular tournament, checking up on your wonderful suggestions, and whatever else happens in the chess world. Thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.